Hello. This lecture is on how to give the first proposition rebuttal speech in the classic online debate format. In this format, you only have 3 minutes in order to be able to answer 5 minutes of argumentation. That means that it's impossible for you to be able to answer everything that your opposition actually says. So you have to be able to utilize that time strategically to figure out those things that are most important for you to answer while setting up yourself for your closing speech. While giving the proposition rebuttal, one of the most important things to do is to think about what sort of arguments you want to go for in your closing speech, which is only 2 minutes long. In order to do that, what you need to think about is what you said in your opening speech that you think is essential for you to be able to win the round on in light of what the opposition said. So in listening to the opposition's opening speech, or the opposition constructive, you need to think, what are the arguments that they're making that you could lose on, and what are the arguments that they have not answered of yours that you think is best suited in order to be able to win the round. And you need to utilize your rebuttal in order to advance those arguments while simultaneously answering those things that would disprove your fundamental thesis. One of the things that is important in doing that is extending those essential arguments from your first proposition constructive. In order to do so, the first thing you need to do is to make your thesis absolutely clear, which means that if you have a planned text where you advocate doing something very specific, i.e., like if you have a specific piece of legislation you're advocating to ban internet pornography, or if you have a specific way that you've defined what life is in regards to whether or not corporations should be able to patent it, or whether or not which forms of stand your ground laws are good or bad, all of these things need to be clearly extended if you're going to have a specific plan text. So if you've defined this house as being a specific house, you should make that clear again in your rebuttal speech, because when you make these things clear, that will be sort of how you utilize your plan text or your advocacy statement as a way to answer back your arguments. So that way, if you're only defending a certain type of thing, i.e., if you're only defending revenge pornography, then you'll be able to say that some of the arguments that the opposition had presented is simply not relevant to the arguments that you're making because you're defending something smaller. Which is why, in that first proposition constructive, it is important to sort of have a more limited scope so you only defend exactly what it is that you want to defend. In this rebuttal, you need to make clear to the judge that what you're defending from the original constructive speech is still what you're defending now, and why what you're defending now doesn't really apply, or doesn't, or the opposition's offense to why it's a bad idea doesn't apply to you. When doing this, you should also point out explicitly what's answered. Almost no opposition in their constructive will answer everything that you've said in your proposition speech because they're busy establishing their own arguments. This means that some of the things that you have said will not be answered by your opponent. You should utilize that strategically. Not only point out to the judge that these arguments were unanswered and that there's no further opportunities for you to be able to get into in-depth debate, but you explain why those arguments that weren't answered are important and integral to the types of arguments that you're trying to win the round on. Which means you tell the judge literally that my opponent has dropped the argument that revenge pornography is something that intrinsically damages the value of individuals who is targeted against, that has a higher likelihood of leading to suicide, which means that even in the world where there should not be heavy regulation in all forms of pornography, that the opponent has conceded that in this specific instance, heavy regulation is necessary in order to prevent suicide. Or, if you're doing like patenting life or something along those lines, you would be able to simultaneously make the arguments that the type of life that you're defining would not preclude other forms of life from being able to be patented, which means that you could extend a specific argument that you have made and then explain why it not being answered is important because of the way it gets you out of all the arguments that the opposition has made. Or, if it's not something like gets you out of the arguments, you should point out why whatever argument is conceded has a bigger implication. So, for instance, if you were saying that that the stand your ground laws do more harm than good, and they haven't answered the couple of scenarios for why they do more harm, say racist violence that's been implemented, you should then say that they have conceded the argument that stand your ground laws often lead to racist forms of violence because of who ends up getting prosecuted, and then you should utilize that conceded argument about how this violence takes place in racist ways and explain why that is more important than anything the opposition has. In any instance What you're doing is taking an argument that has been conceded by your opponent and utilizing it in a way in order to demonstrate why this is the most important argument in the round, and when it hasn't been answered, that's a reason for why the judge would prefer your analysis over their lack of analysis on that point. The other thing that you need to do in your rebuttal speech is you have to answer the opposition's essential and key arguments that exist in the debate round, which means you should watch their video probably more than once to figure out what are those points that are really threatening to what you're saying, those points that are actually answering your argument opposed to just sort of being interesting FYIs. There's a couple of ways that you can answer your opponent's arguments. The first way you could do that is if they read evidence, you should compare the evidence that you've read or that you've cited in your first speech with theirs. In the online format, people have the ability to put their citations that they're referencing right underneath their videos, which means you have the ability to go to the citations and look at what they're actually referencing and look at the studies they're utilizing. If they don't provide you with citations and they are referencing things, you should make that as an argument around that is impossible for you to fact check it and try and ask for either the judge to disregard it or not view it with as much weight as the evidence that you've provided that you have citations for accompanying it. In any case, if citations are available, there's a couple of things that you could do. The first thing is you could compare the quality of their citation with yours, and by doing that you could look at which authors or studies are more qualified than someone else. If their evidence and their citations are coming from blogs or random internet articles or Wikipedia, that's not exactly a very qualified source. So if your articles are coming from peer-reviewed journals or coming from academics or coming from lawmakers or anyone who's more qualified, one of the arguments you can make in the round is that the judge would prefer the evidence that you're citing because your evidence comes from more qualified sources, which means that at the point that both teams are presenting evidence that are making the opposite points, that your evidence is better than theirs based upon qualifications. Another comparative thing you could do is you can compare the dates of when these things were published. Talking about stand your ground laws being beneficial or not in the 1980s is probably not as relevant as reading evidence or making citations that talk about stand your ground laws in 2013, or if this video is still up in a couple years from now, whatever year it is then. And you can make these comparisons and explain why judges should prefer more recent evidence versus older evidence. Not in all cases, when it's published does not necessarily matter. So, for instance, if we're having a philosophical debate about morality versus utilitarianism, when the pieces of evidence or when the citations were made might not be as relevant as something that has to do with the some sort of current political issue. So for patenting life, what constitutes life and how patent law operates is something that could be very subject to when this evidence was published. So when you make a date comparison, you should not only say that your evidence is more recent, but you should make arguments as to why the recency of the evidence is a reason for why they should prefer your arguments to their arguments. The last way that you compare evidence is compare the warrants within the evidence itself. So that way, you can actually look at their warrants and say, that citation does not have any warrants or argument. It's someone who's just spouting off rhetoric and making claims without sort of backing it up. Whereas my evidence has warrants and explains the reasons for why stand your ground laws actually do more harm than good, or why corporate patenting is bad, or why heavy regulation from the United States federal government is necessary in order to beat internet pornography opposed to something else that's taking place. So you should actually explain the warrants that exist within your evidence. Something else that you could do when answering other people's evidence and citations is go to Google Scholar, which is scholar.google.com. Google Scholar has an incredible function that when you put in a citation there or you put in an article, underneath the link when it comes up, there's a part that says cited by. If you click cited by, it'll give you all the academic and websites and articles that are responding or that cite the article that your opponent has used. Some of those will be in favor of it, others will be opposed to it. So if you find evidence that is then opposed to the citations that your opponent provided and you utilize that in your rebuttal speech, that's going to make it a lot more responsive because then you have evidence that directly answers the claims that they're making. And Google Scholar makes this incredibly simple in order to be able to do because you just have to do the internet search and you just have to do it within the world of Google Scholar and going to scholar.google.com opposed to just regular Google, and you'll be able to have that extra level of specificity that your opponent might not have. The other thing you want to pay attention to while answering your opponent is a couple of essential arguments that you want to make sure doesn't go conceded. The first thing is that you should watch out for any procedural arguments. If your opponent has made an argument about what you have done as being unfair or bad for education or cheating or anything along those lines, you need to answer that argument in the speech because otherwise you've conceded that you have lost the debate round because you've done something that hurts the debate from ever taking place. So any procedural argument that they make, you want to justify the action that you've done, whether it is that you've gone over your time limit, or whether it is that you've read too fast, or whether it is that you haven't provided citations. Any of those sort of arguments require you to make a response saying that I only went over by 5 seconds, or that while I didn't provide citations in the text part underneath the video, I clearly cited it with my speech, and you should explain why what you did was not unfair or bad for education. And you should also make the arguments for why you shouldn't lose a round because of it. So even if you went over your time, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to lose a round. You could say that the more proper punishment is that the judge shouldn't pay attention to any arguments that were made after the time limit was up. Or you can make the argument that the judge should be able to pay attention to this, and their opposition should get a little bit more time to make up for it. Or anything else that you think of that would be a more proper punishment than losing the round. The other thing that you have to watch out for is hidden counterplans. A lot of opposition teams like to make counterplans or counterproposals to answer the proposition. And they'll do this not only by saying, we propose the following counterplan, but oftentimes do it as a way of listing other ideas that might be beneficial. So if you're doing corporate patenting of life, they might say, instead of having corporations patent life, there might be a process in order to protect any sort of resource, any sort of discoveries made out of the question of what would have been patented ahead of time. Or they might say that there's a way to have individual patents. Or they might have a way where they say we could have a better definition of life that doesn't include bacteria. In any case, anytime you hear your opponent say that there's potentially another option that could work better, that essentially is something that the opposition in their closing speech can come down to and say, this is a counterplan that we now advocate as a reason for why the affirmative's idea is bad and our idea is better because it has an alternative solution. So you need to make sure that you respond to those, otherwise you've conceded that there's a better way to go about actually solving for the impacts that you're talking about. And when answering counterplans, you want to make sure there's a couple of things that you could do. The first is explain why the counterplan doesn't solve as well as yours does. So if they say in relation to heavy regulation to internet pornography that states should do it or that parents should do it at home, you should make arguments as to why the state's doing it or having parents regulate the internet at home is not as sufficient as the United States federal government taking a stance to regulate pornography. The other thing you do is explain why the counterplan can be done at the same time as the affirmatives plan, which would be essentially what in some forms of debate is called a permutation. And if you could prove that they'd be done simultaneously, i.e. that the federal government and the state governments could regulate it simultaneously, then you show that the counterplan is not an opportunity cost to your proposition plan, which is a reason for why you shouldn't be rejected because of it, because they can essentially be done together. You could also just explain why the counterplan is a bad idea. Some parents aren't really great at regulating children's internet use, so not only is it ineffective at a form of regulation, sometimes it actually enhances children's ability to be able to access things like pornography because they aren't being regulated at home at all, or sometimes are even giving access to this information, which is a reason for why that counterplan of having parents regulating internet pornography would not be a good idea at all. In this rebuttal speech, you should also feel free to use new citations in order to answer your opponent. However, there's a couple of things you should keep in mind. The first thing is you should make sure that you absolutely need that new citation, because if you don't absolutely need that new citation, you might as well rely on the evidence that you used in your initial opening speech, because you only have 3 minutes here to answer 5 minutes of argumentation, which means you want to utilize that time effectively, and just citing piece of evidence after piece of evidence or making a lot of references that weren't in that first speech isn't going to be as good as going back to that original evidence that you cited and sort of explaining it and extrapolating on it and why that answers you around. So you should always prefer to utilizing the cites and evidence that you had in your first speech. But if you need to use a piece of evidence to expand upon a point you've made, you should feel free to do so, because it essentially makes it even harder for the opposition to be able to answer it in their closing speech, because they would have to answer a new citation. Now, in the rebuttals, you're not allowed to read new evidence or make new arguments. However, there's not a really fine line, or it's a very blurred line over what is a new argument and what is an extension of an old argument. So, a couple of things you can do. First is you can reference an argument you made in your opening speech that you're now expanding upon. I said this. This is continuing to be backed up by this other citation that I'm now providing. Or, if the opposition has made arguments, which they have, for the first time, which they necessarily would be because you're answering their first speech, you're allowed to make new arguments and read new evidence that answers those new arguments. So you should be like, my opponent says this. In response, here's this new citation that answers these arguments. Ideally, if you use Google Scholar, your evidence will be amazing in answering theirs because you'll have been able to find someone who actually answers the article that they're citing. In any case, if you point out how this argument is answering something new that's been said or is an extension of something that you've said prior, that doesn't mean that it's a new argument anymore, but rather an answer that is the first available opportunity or an extension. And when you pick your evidence carefully in this regards, you should ideally be picking a piece of evidence that is best suited to win you the round. So anything that you cite in this middle speech, you should really make sure is something that you want to be able to go for in your closing speech, because otherwise you're just sort of wasting your time, and it's better to make analytical arguments that are strong than just sort of giving more citations. But if you give a cite, make sure it's a cite that you know you can win the round with, and that's going to be devastating to your opponent. The other thing is that you always want to end the rebuttal speech, just like any speech, really strong. You shouldn't end with a question, as what happens in the example that accompanies this lecture, because when you end with a question, that allows your opponent in their final speech to answer that question before you do, and if they answer that question effectively, they're probably going to win the round. And you don't want to leave hypotheticals where you leave it up to the judge to provide the answer. It's better to end strong with the answer to the problem or to the question that you're providing than just with the question. This is generally true when you write papers as well, is that you shouldn't just ask questions in your conclusion. Your conclusion should be a restatement of your thesis that essentially explains why your thesis is important, opposed to something that leaves the reader being like, I guess, maybe. What you need to do is end allowing the viewer of this video or the viewer of your speech thinking, yeah, they're right. There's a couple of different ways where you can end strong. The first way, with a devastating counter-argument. And that happens where, during the course of their speech, they've made an argument that is potentially not a very strong one, and you can utilize that as being symptomatic of the entirety of their speech by emphasizing that at the end. It's that they claim this really ridiculous thing, and here's why that argument is so off base. So the last thing the judge hears in your speech is something that proves that what they've said just doesn't make sense in the way that you've answered it. So a lot of times what you could do is answer their worst argument last, and that's going to make you sound the best at the end because you've devastated one of their arguments that, even if it's not their central point, is a point that necessarily makes it seem like you've destroyed everything that they've said if you end strong by restating your thesis in relation to the counter-argument that you're providing. You could also answer some of their stronger arguments with a devastating citation or a devastating argument that necessarily answers it more specifically. The other thing you should do is restate your thesis in a stronger way, which means that when you say that stand your ground laws do more harm than good, here's where you really explain the harm that they do very concisely and succinctly, so that way people clearly know why they do more harm than good and what exactly this harm is. When doing this, one of the things that you should do is comparative impact analysis. This is where you would compare the impacts that you're talking about what we are saying is important versus the impact that they're talking about. Oftentimes in debates, this can be a question of morality versus utilitarianism, i.e., is the racist violence of stand your ground laws worse than what might happen as a result of loss of life if people don't stand their ground? Or, in terms of patenting life, is the patenting of life an intrinsic violation of humanity or the essence of life, versus the cures that could potentially save millions of people as a result of any new drugs that may come out from patenting? Which means that, yes, there's a question about whether or not patenting is the most effective way in order to be able to produce cures or be able to advance scientific research. That's one argument. But the impact comparison is where you put the morality versus the utilitarianism. So that way, even if, as a proposition, you lose that patenting does help create cures, you could say that those cures aren't as important than the violations of basic human rights that come about when people patent things like life. Right? And so if you make these comparisons directly, it's going to be a lot better. Same deal with internet pornography, is that in a lot of situations you're going to have a debate where it's going to come down to the question of free speech versus the question of the negative effects of internet pornography upon the youth or upon populations in general. And you need to compare those two things. And if you end with an explicit comparison, it's going to put you in a very good shape going into your closing, because not only have you explained your arguments and answered your opponent's arguments, but you've also explained that once you win your arguments, why your arguments are better than theirs in terms of actually impacting it out, and why, if you win a certain part of it, just the impact portion of it, you should win the debate round despite, little blips of arguments that they may think responds to you, because it allows the judge to know why your thesis is more important, and that even if you're not right about everything, you're right about the most important elements of the debate. Which brings me back to the original point that I gave up, is that in your 3 minutes to answer 5, because you can't answer everything, you have to strategically pick which things you want to answer, which things you don't want to answer, which of your original arguments you want to extend versus the arguments you don't want to extend. And so you need to strategically select your argument and prioritize your arguments for the judge, so that way they know not only why they're going to vote for you, but on which argument they're going to vote for you, because you've done the work to explain why which argument is more important as a result. You can even say things in your speech like, I don't have to answer these things that they've said because it's irrelevant to the debate due to this other reason, which often comes down to why your impacts outweigh, which makes it very easy for you to utilize your impacts as a reason for why you should win the round, even if you don't answer everything your opponent says. They might have a couple reasons for why regulation might be bad, or a couple reasons for why patenting could be good, but if on the whole the impact of it is worse, that means that you should win the debate round, and you can utilize that as a reason for why you don't have to answer some of the nitpicky types of things. And so doing that impact analysis will allow you to be able to make sure that you can win the round even if you don't answer everything that your opponent says, because it's impossible to answer everything your opponent said. Just like in chess or in like sports, that you sometimes willingly sacrifice certain pieces in order to advance your arguments or your other pieces on the chessboard in order to be able to win the game. Is that every argument on the round is not essential, just like every player on the football field is not essential for you to score. What's essential is that your couple of key points line up in order to be able to win that. Just like with all the players that exist on the football field, there's only 2, or sometimes only 1, that needs to actually be able to score, and the rest are there to sort of distract. Which means that you should utilize some arguments not just as a distraction, but as a way to sort of build up the basis of what you're going for. But in the end, essentially you're setting yourself up in your rebuttal speech to win a single argument in your closing speech for why you deserve to win the debate round. And the best way to do that is strategically picking and making comparative analysis in your rebuttal speech, so that way when it comes to the closing speech, you've already done the work necessary to win the round, and then you just have to re-summarize that in relation to whatever the opposition's closing says. Lastly, as always, before you post a video to the site, you should make sure that that video actually has a sound and audio in a way that people could hear. One of the benefits of the online debating system and the online debate platform that has been explained prior is that you have the ability to re-watch your videos and be able to make improvements as a result. If you're technologically savvy, you can use editing software so that way you can replace like a 30-second or a minute chunk that you happen to screw up on in order to have a speech that's exactly perfect. If you don't have, that technological savvy to be able to do editing, it's alright, because when you're only given a 3-minute long speech, it is not unreasonable to give it 3 or 4 times, because even if you give it, let's say 5 times, that's 15 minutes of your life giving speeches to give the perfect speech that you want to be able to give in order to win the debate round, which means it's worth watching your video, watching your opponent's video after you've made your video, and seeing how you could have made that speech better, and then re-recording it, not only to make sure that technologically everything came through, such as sound and video and stuff like that, but also making sure that you made the smartest arguments in relation to what your opponent has said, and that you haven't dropped anything that is essential that you could potentially lose the round on. Because as much as you have to make sure you win the round, you also have to make sure you don't lose the round, which means that you have to make sure that you're answering anything that you think might be a devastating argument that your opponent might go for in their closing speech, so that way in your closing speech you explain why you answered in your rebuttal and why your answer is still true in light of everything that they'll say in their upcoming speech. And that'll bring you back to the comparative arguments that I was talking about earlier about how you compare qualifications, dates, and warrants, and explain which elements of the debate are more important than other elements of the debate. I hope this lecture has been helpful, and should you have any questions, feel free to make comments in the video section underneath, or feel free to shoot me a message through the online debate platform's messaging system. Either way, I will be happy to respond, and it'll be very exciting to watch your videos in the upcoming weeks. Thank you.